Welcome to the Stories That Shape Us podcast. My name is Joanna Danielle. As this is Domestic Abuse Awareness Month, I've been posting around domestic abuse, raising awareness around this really important subject. And last week, our guest talked about share her story and some of the things that she experienced and give some advice about what people who experience domestic abuse can do to help themselves and even people in churches, what they can do to help women who disclose domestic abuse. Today, my guest, she's been here before, but not on the video recording of the podcast, just on audio. If you go back on Spotify and listen to He Didn't Hit Me, Dinnia has been here before. I think it was last year, Dinnia, that you
Yeah,
were
it
here
was.
before.
Yeah.
And she's decided to come again today and to share her story. This time we're going to talk about some of the things that, in retrospect, she knew that these were red flags, but she didn't know what they were before. And it is our hope that as you listen, if you're in this situation or if you know somebody who is in this situation, that you can share these with them so that they can know and have information that Dinya did not have, so that they can make decisions about how to proceed in this relationship. So welcome again, Dinya.
Okay. Thank you for having me, Joanna.
How does it feel to be here again on the podcast?
Uh, I think it's a good opportunity because um it's always good to share so that others can gain knowledge. I look back at my own story and I wish I knew things that I know now. So
Yeah.
yeah, glad to share.
Yes. If I knew then what I know now. The
Mm.
song, I think it's Kenny Rogers that song. Let's not sing that song. Um, so we're gonna talk about red flags today that you saw. Now you know that they were red flags. Let's talk. So you talked about inconsistency, lying, bitterness and anger, and not friendly towards others. Talk us through about what did you see around inconsistency that you think it would be useful for people to know if somebody's inconsistent. What does that mean? Inconsistent how?
Okay. So I'd, I'll try and remember like examples. It's been so far back and I
Mm,
have tried to sort of put things in the past. But yeah, it was like making plans about certain things and then not coming through.
mm.
I think in the beginning though, I'll honestly say that I didn't even see those things. It's now, like you said, looking back in retrospect, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. Now
Breaking
I get.
promises.
Yeah, so breaking promises was definitely one of them. Um, like without going into too much details, there were
Sure.
like times when I'd ask, about certain things, and I'd get one story.
Mm-hmm.
Like at another time, the story would be different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So thinking about it now, back then, my mind is was like so clouded, so clouded. So
Sure.
those things that I didn't actually see them,
Yeah.
didn't actually see them.
Yeah.
I recall one occasion where I found something out,
Mm-hmm.
and when I asked about it, I was given one story. I
Hmm.
later found out that the story that I was given wasn't the correct story.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was just things like those.
Hmm.
And I'm like, now you look back and you think, okay, got it now.
Yeah. So the inconsistency in the inconsistencies become lying, isn't it? If there
Mm,
is this story, but then this one is told at different times, and then there's another story and another story. And
mm,
what we would normally do is just see that as something to work through in a relationship. Like we're just going to work through it in a relationship. They've apologized or not. Sometimes they don't apologize. But sometimes a person at this phase, and like especially in the early days of the relationship, would just try and work through it and think, I'm gonna put it behind me, things will change. But these
mm,
things just maintain consistency. The only thing that is consistent is the inconsistency.
Yeah. Yeah, true.
So
That's
it
one way of looking at it,
yeah, but
definitely.
it's so important that people knows that the inconsistency that you're seeing now, that will be consistent. The lying will be consistent. The breaking promises will be consistent. And what sometimes victims starts to do is to question themselves. Am I unforgiving? Do I require too much? Should I change? And when you start to question yourself around those things, you know that something is off, something is wrong.
Mm. Yeah, you see, now that you've mentioned that, yeah, I did do a bit of that as well, because I recall prior to being in a relationship with my ex-husband, I had other relationships,
Yeah.
and I was, I'd say I was very unforgiving. So as
Mm,
soon as you make a mistake, that's it. I cut and I'm gone.
right.
And I think when I met him, I started thinking to myself, but nobody's perfect. So
Mm,
I think in a way I started compromising a lot.
hmm.
I started compromising a lot. So if I think about that lie that he had told, if that was before, there's no way I would have stayed.
Yeah.
There's no way I would have stayed. But I'd got to that point where I was becoming more, what's the word? I was looking to, I was looking at things and thinking, there's nobody perfect really. So, you
Mm,
know, let me forgive and let me move on.
right.
And I think I did that too often.
Right. So, so ironic, isn't it? In that stage of your life when you were beginning to change and you were beginning to give people chances and not cut off and move on, that's when you really needed to cut off and move on. But by then
Mm,
you were starting to say, let me forgive. Let me give people an opportunity to change and grow. But none of the opportunities that you gave resulted in change or growth.
no, no,
None
definitely not.
none of the forgiveness resulted in that. What do you mean about talk about isolation? Because one of the tactics that abusers use is isolation. Isolate from family and friends. You're not allowed to, oftentimes a victim's not allowed to see family and friends, or very rarely, or only can see family and friends if the perpetrator is with them to kind of monitor what they say, how they say it, what they're doing, because it's about their image and maintaining a certain image with families.
Mm,
Sometimes they'll go as far as telling victims things about their family and friends that will make the victim pull away. So they're the sole person that they're in contact with. They are completely dependent on the perpetrator. Maybe yours was not that extreme, but how did isolation work?
mm. Yeah, I don't think mine was as extreme, but I think possibly 6 months into the relationship, yeah, possibly 6 months, um, there was a holiday that was booked basically. Myself and my sister was gonna go on this holiday. Um, and the accommodation that was booked was, large enough to accommodate more than two people. So I mentioned it and he said, "Oh yeah, I'll come along." Um, so we were away and there were certain activities that my sister wanted to do.
Mm,
There was also ability or access to, it was Disneyland, I'll just say it was Disneyland. So
yeah,
there was this access to certain parks because my sister knew someone at the time.
right.
So a lot of the activities that we did was geared towards that. And he started saying, well, why am I doing everything that my sister wants to do and not what we should be doing together?
Right.
And I sort of said, but remember, this was booked before. I
Mhm.
invited you along. Really, you didn't have to come. I didn't think like that at the time, but now I'm looking, you didn't have to come. And you're here now, and you're saying, well, it should be about us. Why is your sister? And so forth. So I thought to myself, what do I do? And at the time, I was in a very people pleasing stage. So I was very torn. And I remember the day when he said it, it wasn't as we are speaking now. It was quite, it was quite harsh, some of the things that he said.
Right.
And I cried. I remember we were stood in the queue at one of the parks, and all I could do was just cry.
Mm.
Everybody else around me was like having fun and excited about what they're about to do, and I was just there crying away.
Mm.
Um, so I look back at that now, and had I known what I know now, I would have realized from that point that, oh, this person is not really looking to be involved in those that surround me. He wants me to be with him and
Mm.
do things with him. And it's as if though nobody else should be involved.
Yeah.
So that was then. Again, I forgave. Because one of the things that he would do is he could be very angry at one point, and he'll just say what's on his mind, however he feels like saying it, not thinking about how it's coming across. And then the next minute, it could be like really loving.
Wow. Hot and
And
cold.
yeah. So, of course, when it comes back to that person that I thought I fell in love with,
Yeah.
I would forgive.
Sure.
And obviously, that carried on
Mhm.
into the marriage because I eventually married him. And then during the marriage, that was sort of what was being played out.
Mhm.
Sweet as pie one minute, and then the next minute it's like, saying really unkind words. And there was that blame thing as well.
Yeah.
So like again, he was very subtle in how he did things because, like I said, when all this was happening, I didn't see it as abuse. I didn't see it as
No.
abuse at all. Um, so he would come across, I said, very sweet, and then bitter on the other side. I think going back to the red flags, one of the things that he did um, that I sort of again overlooked was he had a child from a previous relationship, and he would spend time with that child, and I would be there, and I would see when the child comes, he'd be very unhappy and he'd be very critical, and why does the child look like this and all that kind of stuff. Now, I was looking at that as, oh, he actually, he cares about his child and he wants the best for the child and so forth. But then on the other end of that, he was being very bitter towards the child's mom.
Yeah.
Um, so again, missed that because I later experienced it,
Mm.
after I became the ex,
Mm.
that bitterness.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it was a lot. It was a lot going on that I didn't actually spot. But now I'm like, okay. Yeah.
And before you go on, Dinya, that's so important to know because I think sometimes when a relationship ends and somebody's moving on to another relationship, some people might think it's okay and normal to talk about the ex in really bad ways, but especially when there's a child, if you can't speak of this person with any kind of kindness and compassion, I think that's something to look out for. Why are they, if they're doing that to the ex, then if God forbid I become an ex, then I'm going to be the subject of the same
Mm,
kind of insults and the same kind of talk. And so I always encourage, especially women, don't encourage it because that the ex, all these things that they're saying might not be true. And as you said, but you didn't know that, but it's as you're reflecting, it's a whole
mm,
part of the package that should have been red flag that wasn't because you didn't know at the time.
yeah. 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 So I say to myself, I've learned the hard way.
Mm,
And now I'm hoping that like others will be educated. Educate yourself before you take that step.
Yeah.
Um, because I think for me, I grew up without my mom present. My dad has never been present, even till today.
Mm.
So my grandparents was there, but it was a case of they were there to provide, and that relationship that you will have with a parent, I never experienced that. And in a lot of ways, I looked after myself a lot growing up.
Mhm.
So when I got to that stage now where I thought, okay, I want to, experience marriage and all that kind of stuff, really, there was nobody there for me to ask these questions to. Unfortunately, by then, my grandparents had passed.
Right.
And what I can remember from their relationship, um, it is very, when I was very young. So a lot of the things that if I'd picked those up at a later stage of my development, it would have benefited me. When I was living with my grandparents, I was very young and I didn't understand a lot of the things at that point. So yeah, so now when I got to that stage of thinking of, relationships, marriage and all that kind of stuff, I had no clue what to look out for. Nobody was there to tell me anything. And I I used to read, but I would read those romance novels and those kind of
Mm.
books.
Yeah.
And so what I was learning was far from reality.
Yeah.
So when I went looking for love, so to speak, those are the things that I was looking for,
Mm.
not reality. Um, Now we're in an age as well where even if you don't read, you can listen to a podcast.
Yeah.
You can jump on the internet, do your own research. I wasn't fortunate. I talk to my children now, and I told my daughter that the first time I got a phone is when I was like 18 years old, and she was like, "What, mommy?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So I didn't really have a lot of access to like technology as
Yeah.
the younger generation do now. So again, there was factors that sort of influenced why I wasn't more educated.
So you're
And so
saying
I went
that
into it blind.
information wasn't as available to you as it is now. And
Mm,
as we're doing the Stories That Shape Us podcast, you're talking about some of the underlying causes you feel that led you to not being able to spot that this was a red flag or
mm,
to experience love in a way that was safe and healthy because you
mm,
never had that
no.
kind of love with parents that were not present and grandparents that by that time, well, they did what they knew how to do. They provided um,
Mm,
the physical things, but not emotional connection. And you were saying some of those things you feel contributed to your inability to spot what the red flags was, or even to the confidence to represent yourself in ways that was going to be helping you to make decisions differently. And
mm,
I will say that the different people who experience domestic abuse, it's no respecter of persons, education, class, culture, it's no respecter of persons. But in doing this work for, I'm going to say nearly 2 decades now, one of the things that I know that I have to work with when somebody's healing, oftentimes healing abandonment wounds help a victim to make different decisions. I see that time and time again, that sometimes abandonment plays a wound in inability to set boundaries, in inability to see and to the confidence and the self-esteem to act for on behalf of self. Now, I want to say again that this is not the only reason, but I see it
mm,
in a lot of cases where that is an underlying cause. And you're saying, and that's why I want to pull this out in the Stories That Shape Us podcast, because for people to know that abuse is no way at all your fault, ever your
mhm,
fault. But as Dinnia is looking back and she's reflecting, so we don't repeat the same pattern. So we don't fall for the same kind of people, because sometimes that happens. We fall for the
mm,
same kind of people because the early wounds hasn't been healed. with, fall for the same kind of people. So I'm really glad that you've shared that I didn't, not only access to information, because unfortunately abuse is still happening and we have access to information. So that's why the sharing of stories is so important. So somebody can examine, have I got these wounds that I need healing? What
Mhm.
makes me what has made me repeat the pattern in the last two relationships? And how can I break this pattern for myself so I don't repeat it in another relationship?
Yeah. So as you mentioned that, Joanna, that's been part of my story. So those childhood traumas, um, I was responding to them, but in very negative light. So I personally didn't feel loved as I was growing up as a child. Doesn't mean that I wasn't loved, but I
Mm,
didn't feel loved.
right.
Um, I mentioned about my mom. She did a very good job in other ways, but because she wasn't present,
Hmm.
um, I didn't have that sort of relationship, mother-daughter relationship growing up. It was when I was, I think, 16 that I came and lived with my mom, and by then there was no bond.
Of course.
Um, so I've spent a lot of my life thinking, right, I wasn't loved.
Mm,
So of course, I was then looking for love through a relationship.
mm,
Um, and like I mentioned before, I had relationships prior, but I was also at that stage where I was like self-preservation mode.
mm,
So as soon as you say or do, that's it, gone. Not letting you do that to me, not letting you hurt me. But then I'd got to that stage with my ex-husband where I was like, okay, Dinnia, I think you might have to just, be a bit more forgiving and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, the people pleasing,
mm,
again, because I didn't feel loved and lots of rejection issues, I
mm,
was always trying to appease others, basically.
mm.
So of course, some of the things that he did during the relationship
Yeah,
or asked, I complied,
of course.
you know. So, and that was a pattern.
Yeah.
With him, it went to the extreme because we got married. But like with previous relationships, I would try to please
Hmm.
at my own expense a lot of times.
Yeah.
Um, and again, I didn't actually see all that happening.
Mm,
I can honestly say I didn't realize all that was going on until maybe just under 12 months ago,
mm.
last December. I remember it very well.
Putting the pieces
Um,
together.
I I I had gone through that cycle, constant cycle. And then last December, I just had that what we call that light bulb moment.
Mm.
And thanks to you, Joanna, I'll say thanks to you because I started listening to your podcast. And for 3 weeks I binged
Yeah.
I binged your podcast and I had shut off from as much of the world as possible.
Mhm.
I had sent messages out to different people and just say, if you don't hear from me, I'm okay. If it's an
Right.
emergency, please do call, but otherwise you won't be hearing from me.
Wow.
And that's when I sat with myself for the first time
Wow.
and I saw all the things that I'd been playing out in my life, but I hadn't really looked at them.
You didn't know what
Had
they were.
didn't know what they were. And I was like, oh my God. So thank you. You
I'm
helped.
so glad. I am
You
so
helped.
glad that it was able to help you to do that.
Yeah. So it was then that I started realizing all these responses that I'd been giving off.
Mm.
And they were because of the traumas that I'd had.
Hmm.
I didn't even know they were traumas.
Hmm.
Um, so for my most of my life, I'd been responding in that way.
Mm.
And then because of that, I was attracting the wrong people.
Hmm.
Don't know fully why, but I was attracting the wrong people. And so people would come in and they would try and play the same tactics.
Yeah,
Um, and some people would get away with it, so to speak.
sure.
So yeah. now that I've recognized that boundaries were something that I didn't really have much of, so
Mm.
I've put those in place.
Mm.
And slowly I've started to realize who's there and who isn't.
Yes.
Um, but I'm in a happier place because now I recognize that, okay, I can put boundaries in place. People can respect them or they might not. And by people respecting or not respecting, I know who to keep and who to let go of.
That's
So
it.
I've done a lot of letting go of um, individuals and also things that I used to hold on to. I've let them go now. So yeah, I am very grateful. I'm in a much better place.
Whoa, that's so good. You unpack some of the stories that shape you, that help you to have an understanding of yourself and the choices that you were making, and therefore the patterns that you were attracting. Because I think
Mm,
sometimes that's it, patterns like love bombing, somebody who's doing love bombing, it would, for somebody who grew up without love and really want it and is unsure because of the low self-esteem starts from there. When you want love, you don't have it, there's insecure attachment. Somebody who comes in, they're not secure either. They're harmful and they're having this pattern of love bombing. It's a recipe for the two to come together because I want what you're trying, I want what you can't give me, but it looks like you can. So I'm going to, because that's the pattern I'm familiar with, because my
yeah.
caregivers couldn't give it to me and I needed it from them. And I was doing things sometimes to get this, I was doing things to get this response. And so, oh, this is the pattern. This is the pattern of what we're doing. And so that's why it's so important to unpack the stories that shape us so that when those unhealthy people come along, you know, not for you, those unhealthy people. So as you said, now you've put boundaries in place and you know the people who don't respect your boundaries, that it's not about you, it is about them. They just don't get to stay.
Mm,
Just don't get to stay. Well done
true.
for doing that work. For and now you can share that with people to say, hey, if you see these patterns, if you're recognizing these patterns, when somebody can't love you, they really can't love you. But sometimes we have to go learn what love is in order to
Mm,
know when we're not loved well.
yeah, yeah. So that's something that I'll say I'm still learning.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I've looked at a lot of things over the last few months, and I recognize that when we don't have that love or the love of God,
Hmm.
then we can't really love. We can't truly love.
Or receive love.
Yeah, or receive it. And so now, I think in the beginning, I was like very angry, very angry. Why did I allow myself to go through all that? Why did I stay so long? Why is he like that? And all those kind of questions. And now I am at a place now where I can say, I've forgiven him
Mm.
because even though I don't know a lot of details about his own background, I knew some things.
Yeah.
And some of the things I think that he was, or that the ways, the responses he was displaying is he was in a similar position to myself,
Lack of
broken,
love, broken.
yeah, broken, and hadn't looked into it. No excuse for what he did, but I can see why. So I'm just thankful. I'm just thanking God because He's opened my eyes so much to a lot of things that I didn't see before. And I think I'll touch on that as well, in that when I was looking for love, I was looking for that love from others around me,
Mhm.
and I didn't recognize the love that God has for me. Um, I recognized that I wasn't in a place at the time when I was, as we'll say, trying to figure out who you are.
Sure.
Um, God wasn't really in the picture.
Mm. Were you a
Um,
Christian at that time?
well, I'll say yes because I was born into a Christian family.
Okay.
Grew up what in like I said with grandparents, so there's no excuse why you're not going to church and all that kind of stuff. Um, got baptized at 16, and then I moved country. So I left the Caribbean, came here, and I did try. I really did try to keep that going, but I had no encouragement around me. And so I fell out. I fell out
Mm.
of the church,
Yeah.
or shall I say, I decided to leave
Yeah.
because everything was different. My issues with rejection didn't know how to deal with it. So going into a church environment where you're not getting that love, that encouragement, and all that kind of stuff, um, I thought, don't see the point of being here.
So let's unpack that for a little bit, Dinya, because you said you didn't grow up with your mom. You met her when you were 16, I imagine when you moved here,
Mhm.
and there's no connection because there's no relationship. You move into a church where you were new, and there I imagine there was some rejection there too. You're the new person trying to come into a circle, and one of the things that we don't know how to do well is open up the circle sometimes, unfortunately.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so at home, there must have been some difficulty in adjusting to a new country, a new person who's supposed to be your mom, but they are a stranger in effect. And so how alone was that? What was that feeling like? I imagine you must have been feeling really alone at that time.
Mm.
Who did you have as a go-to person to support you or to talk to or to share those feelings with that you were feeling?
Well, there was nobody present physically in this country. So the person that I would phone would be my grandmother.
Uh-huh.
So I would phone my grandmother and I would say, "Oh, Gran, this is happening and that's happening." And, she would try her best to like comfort me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there was actually nobody.
Nobody.
There was
A
nobody.
16-year-old feeling lost in a new place, new culture, different accent, figuring out simple life things like how to get the bus and fit into college and fit into church, and fit in at home, I imagine.
Mm, yeah, because when I came here, I'd left all my friends behind. I'd left the church community that I was used to. I had to transition into new school, um, which I got rejected as well. Um,
By
so
the
then
people or by what was the
by the
rejection through?
system, by
By
the
the
system.
system.
Yeah.
Mm,
So like for example, my sister, who's younger, she could attend school,
right.
but because I was 16 and over now,
Sure.
I couldn't.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of changes, a lot of transitions. And I would like go to church, but I was like just there. Nobody was very welcoming. Um, the service itself was like structured different. Um, attitudes were different. Everything was just so different.
Mm.
Um, there was criticism
Of
from
you.
like older generation.
Right.
So I'd got to that stage where I thought, you know what, I'm not happy here.
P.
And so slowly I stopped going.
Mm.
So as a result, I was trying to fit in somewhere else. So I tried to fit in with people at college, people at work, because I started working quite quickly after I came here, part-time. But the people that I was now surrounded by weren't able to guide me spiritually. So of course, people pleasing again.
Mm.
Would you like to go out? Oh yeah, why not? Just wanting to fit in. So
Mm.
I'd say I ended up in going out like to clubs and things like those. And those were like really far, very strange from me, but just wanting to fit in.
Because that's not your life.
That
That's not what
wasn't
you
my
knew.
scene. It wasn't my scene.
Yeah. But isn't it
Uh,
interesting that people that were not in the church, not Christians, would pull you in, but the ones who were, they didn't. There was no space for you in those groups.
yeah. Um, and unfortunately, it's still the same now. Um,
You mean for teenagers
but
or for you?
for teenagers,
Yeah.
for teenagers in the church, I've seen it. Um,
Mm.
I I'm at that stage now where I'm looking at me, I'm looking at myself and saying, right, the things that I didn't like when I was that age, how can I reach at least one?
Yeah.
How can I reach that one teenager and say, right,
Pull her
I might
in.
not know exactly how you're feeling, but I do understand
Hmm.
and sort of become that person who they could come to because I never had that.
Mm.
So
Mm.
yeah,
Mm.
those are the things that I'm looking into now.
Sounds like a ministry. I deliberately look for people on the edges as well because I know sometimes when people are in their groups, they can't see the people that are on the edges. And
Mhm,
so I deliberately look for the people on the edges. I am an
mhm,
introvert, so I don't have a group of people that I'm in, so I'm closed in and I can't see. So the people
mhm,
are on the edges probably easier for me to see, but it takes so much intentionality to see that there's a young person who is not a part of a group. There's a young person who is looking isolated. There's a woman who is isolated.
mhm,
There's a young man who is isolated. They're alone all the time. They come and they slip out. They don't
mhm,
seem to be talking to anybody. We have to be so intention not to miss. Because sometimes we can be so wrapped up in our own world and our own circles that we miss the
mhm.
fact that they're people who needs us.
Yeah, so true. So true. Yeah. So yeah, lots and lots of reflections, looking how I can move forward, how I can be of help to someone else.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, those were some of the influences around the choices that I made. Um, and I think I'd got to that stage where once I'd got in, now married, I thought I had to stay.
That's it. So that's it. I've made my bed, we say. I've made
Yeah,
my bed, I have to lie in it, but you
yeah,
don't. For a woman who is listening, you do not have
yeah.
to stay in the suffering.
No, no, no. I look back now and I'm thinking to myself, oh, could have gone ages ago. Why did I not leave?
Hmm.
But sometimes God allows things to happen in our lives.
Mm.
Not saying that he's caused it or anything like that, but it, we grow from them. And what I've learned just from observation is like even yourself now, Joanna, um, the job that you do now, it was because you have been there yourself. So now you're able to understand, you're able to empathize, and you're able to respond in the right way.
Yeah.
So I look at my own situation now and I think, had I not gone through that, I couldn't be sharing this story now that might be helping someone.
You just share a different story, didn't you? I think you would just share a different story. But I think, yeah, I'm grateful, and I know that people who watch this who are in that similar situation will also be grateful because they know that they can do it too. So you said something as we wrap up. I want us to kind of focus on this for the next few minutes. You said, why didn't I leave? So having left and on this side,
Mhm.
There's a woman I know, many of them, who are in that
Mhm.
position of fear. I can't leave. I won't
Mhm.
manage. I won't survive. What would I do for money? How will I manage the children? They have all those questions that maybe you had in those days before you left. Tell
Mhm.
her how you managed. How did you manage after leaving? And here you are saying, I'm sharing my story so that you can benefit. How can you help her?
Okay. So I mentioned before about spotting those red flags. I mentioned about educating yourself.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that I have more faith now. When I started that journey, my faith wasn't as strong as it is now.
Hmm.
So for me personally, I know faith has done a lot for me.
Mm.
My trust in God has helped me a lot to get to where I am right now.
Mm.
Um, Before that though, what I looked at was why should I allow myself to be treated less than I should be?
Right.
I had set certain boundaries. They might not have been very clear, but I had set certain boundaries. And one of the things that I had said to my ex-husband was, I will not allow anyone to hit me,
Mm.
and I will not allow anyone to mistreat my children.
Right.
Um, he stepped over that boundary, and so he hit me.
Mm.
And at that point, that was there was nothing else for me to think about. Absolutely nothing else.
No
I knew
forgiveness for that one.
I am worth more than this.
Mm.
And so I walked away.
Mm.
I didn't know how I was going to cope. I was working, I must say. I didn't know how I was going to cope. I didn't know what was going to happen with the children. No idea. But I thought to myself, I am worth more than this.
Mm.
And you are worth more than this.
Mm.
Always remember that.
Mhm.
You are special.
Yeah,
You have a purpose in this life.
that's it.
And when you have God in the picture, He will help you through every step of the way.
Mm.
This podcast wouldn't be long enough for me to explain just how God sent the right people at the right time.
Mm.
Um, I remember I went as far as almost not knowing where I was going to live with the children.
Mm.
God allowed us to stay in the home. Um, so trust in God.
Mm.
He will take you through it
Love it.
and take it one day at a time.
Mm.
Um, there'll be days when you might be feeling like there's no hope.
Mm.
There is hope. Um, Allow God to guide you daily. When you do that, it doesn't feel as overwhelming. If you sit and think about all that's happening, everything that's happened, it becomes a lot. So just take it one step at a time. There was practical things that I had to do. So, like for example, I had to prioritize the children.
Mhm.
Um, Initially, that was, but then once I had got them settled, I then looked at how to help myself.
Mm.
So I went into counseling, had a bit of therapy, learned about how to cope as a single parent. So I've read books, how do you cope mentally? Spiritually, I go for my Bible. Um, so just take those steps day in, day out, and trust in God, and He will take you through it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Trust God, He will take you through it. I can attest to that. For the years that I've been doing this, Dinnia, I have seen God being so faithful to people, so, so faithful. He looks after them. And when there was risk of housing, He provided, He
Mm.
provided food, He provided money, He provided support. He really will never leave you alone when you're having to take that big step of securing your safety and your children's safety. He
Mm,
loves and looks after
definitely.
you. Thank you so much, Dinnia, for coming. You know, the piece that is resonating with me, you said last year, December, you shut yourself away, but you didn't isolate. You told your friends and family where you were and that you were okay, but you settled down with yourself to do some work on yourself.
Mm,
And that's a part of the journey.
yeah.
I know that we're probably going to have you back, Dinnia, because when you finish that book, we want to have you back to, to talk about it because I know it's going to be so life-changing
Yeah.
for people. Thank you so much for coming again. Is there any final thing you want to say?
Final words. Just trust God.
Trust him.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join us on the next story.
No problem. Thank you, Joanna.